Jonathan Calloway sat alone in his grand, sprawling mansion, the silence broken only by the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. The vast space around him seemed to amplify his loneliness, a feeling that had become all too familiar over the years. At 72, Jonathan was a man of wealth and accomplishment, but as he sat there on Christmas Eve, he felt the sting of his true poverty, love, and connection. He had once been a husband, a father, a man with a family, but those roles had slipped away from him, leaving only memories and regrets. The soft glow of the fireplace cast flickering shadows across the room as Jonathan nursed a glass of whiskey, his mind drifting to the past. He thought about his children, Margaret, Daniel, and Paul, and the arguments that had driven them apart. He thought about Emily, his ex-wife, whose bitterness had poisoned what little remained of their family ties. But most of all, he thought about his own failures, the choices he had made that had pushed his loved ones away. Every holiday brought those memories back, but this night, something felt different. A restlessness gnawed at him, a pull he couldn't quite explain. Rising from his chair, Jonathan grabbed his coat and scarf. He had one tradition left, one way to honor his late mother, who had instilled in him a sense of duty to those less fortunate. Every Christmas Eve, he loaded his car with toys and donations for a nearby children's shelter. It wasn't much, but it was something, a way to feel like he still had a purpose. The air outside was bitterly cold, the kind of cold that burned your lungs with each breath. Snow blanketed the streets of Boston, and the city seemed almost otherworldly in its stillness. As Jonathan carefully maneuvered his car through the icy roads, he noticed how empty the world looked tonight. Most people were home, surrounded by loved ones, celebrating the warmth of the season. The thought brought an ache to his chest that he tried to shake off. Turning a corner, Jonathan's headlights caught a small figure trudging along the sidewalk. He slowed the car, his brow furrowing as he realized it was a child. A little girl, no more than 8 or 9, wearing a thin coat and no gloves. She clutched a stuffed bear to her chest, her steps unsteady as the wind whipped around her. Jonathan pulled over, rolling down his window. "Excuse me," he called out. "Are you all right?" The girl stopped, her wide eyes locking onto his. She looked frightened but didn't run. "I'm fine," she said softly, her voice barely audible over the wind. "You're out here all alone?" Jonathan asked, stepping out of the car. "Where are your parents?" The girl hesitated, clutching her bear tighter. I don't have anywhere to go." The words hit Jonathan like a punch to the gut. He glanced around, but there was no one else in sight, just the swirling snow and the dim glow of streetlights. "Come on," he said gently, holding out his hand. "Let's get you somewhere warm." The girl looked at him warily, but something in his voice seemed to reassure her. She took his hand, and Jonathan led her to the car, wrapping his scarf around her neck before helping her into the passenger seat. He turned up the heat and watched as the color slowly returned to her cheeks. "What's your name?" he asked as he started driving. "Lily," she replied, her voice still small. "Lily Parker." "Well, Lily," Jonathan said, glancing at her with a soft smile, "you're safe now. Let's get you to the shelter." When they arrived at the children's shelter, Jonathan explained the situation to the staff, but something didn't sit right with him. Lily looked so lost, so fragile, and the thought of leaving her there alone felt unbearable. After a long conversation with the shelter coordinator, Jonathan offered to take Lily home with him for the night, just until social services could intervene. It was a decision he couldn't quite explain, even to himself, but as he drove back to his mansion with Lily asleep in the seat beside him, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years: hope. Back at the house, Jonathan set up a small guest room for Lily, making sure she had everything she needed. She barely spoke, but her eyes lingered on the Christmas tree in the corner of the living room, its lights twinkling like stars. Jonathan caught the look and paused. "Do you like Christmas trees?" he asked. Lily nodded, her expression softening. "We used to have one," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Jonathan felt his chest tighten. "Well," he said gently, "this one's for both of us now." As the night wore on, Jonathan sat by the fire again. But this time, he wasn't alone. Upstairs, Lily was sleeping, and for the first time in years, the house didn't feel so empty. He didn't know what the next day would bring, but something told him that this Christmas Eve would change everything. The morning sunlight filtered through the frosted windows of Jonathan's mansion, casting a soft golden glow across the room. For the first time in years, the house felt alive, not bustling or noisy, but with a warmth Jonathan couldn't ignore. The faint sound of footsteps caught his attention as he sat in the kitchen, nursing his first cup of coffee. He turned to see Lily standing hesitantly in the doorway, still clutching her stuffed bear. Her small frame seemed even more fragile in the oversized pajamas he'd lent her, which had once belonged to his daughter Margaret, long ago. "Good morning," Jonathan greeted, trying to sound cheerful. Lily's big, wary eyes studied him before she nodded slightly. "Good morning," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. She stepped into the kitchen cautiously, her gaze darting to the high ceilings, the polished counters, and the ornate chandelier above the table. It was clear she wasn't used to such surroundings. "Are you hungry?" Jonathan asked, gesturing to the plate of toast and scrambled eggs he'd prepared. Lily hesitated before nodding again. He motioned for her to sit, and she climbed into a chair, tucking her knees up as if to make herself smaller. Jonathan placed the plate in front of her and watched as she picked at the food, eating slowly, almost timidly. As she ate, Jonathan tried to make conversation. "Where are you from, Lily?" She didn't answer immediately, her small hands gripping the fork tightly. "I don't know," she finally said, her voice trembling slightly. "We used to live in a big building, but then we didn't anymore." Jonathan's brow furrowed. "What about your parents? Your mom?" At the mention of her mother, Lily's face crumpled, and she looked down at her plate. "She's gone. I don't know where." Jonathan felt a pang in his chest. He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "And your dad?" Lily shook her head, her lips pressing into a tight line. "I never met him," she said softly. Her response was like a puzzle piece falling into place for Jonathan, though the picture it was forming remained incomplete. He didn't want to push her further, not yet, but something about her words and her presence felt uncannily familiar. As the day unfolded, Jonathan found himself keeping Lily close, unsure what else to do. She seemed to take comfort in the warmth of the house, though she rarely strayed far from his side. When she finally ventured into the living room, her eyes lit up at the sight of the Christmas tree. She stood in front of it, staring at the ornaments and the glittering lights as if seeing something magical. Jonathan watched her from the armchair, his heart softening with each passing moment. "Would you like to help me decorate it?" he asked. Lily turned to him, her expression a mix of surprise and delight. "Really?" she asked, her voice tinged with hope. "Of course," Jonathan replied, smiling. "It's been a long time since I had any help with it." Together, they carefully unpacked boxes of ornaments that had been stored away for years. Lily was gentle, handling each piece as though it were a treasure. As they worked, Jonathan found himself reminiscing about the past. He told her about the times his children had helped him decorate the tree when they were young, and to his surprise, Lily listened intently, her eyes wide with curiosity. When the tree was finally finished, Lily stood back and admired their work. "It's beautiful," she said softly, and for a moment, Jonathan saw a spark of joy in her eyes. It was fleeting, but it was enough to remind him why he had brought her into his home. She needed more than shelter. She needed to feel safe, to feel loved. That evening, Jonathan called the shelter to check on their plans for Lily. The coordinator informed him that they were still waiting to hear back from social services and suggested that Lily stay with him for another night. The idea didn't trouble him as much as he thought it would. In fact, he found himself relieved. Though he had spent years guarding his heart, something about this little girl was breaking through his defenses. After dinner, Lily sat cross-legged on the floor by the fire, drawing with some crayons Jonathan had found in an old drawer. He watched her quietly, noting the way her brow furrowed in concentration. She seemed so young, yet there was a heaviness about her, as if she had experienced far more than any child should. "Lily," he said gently, breaking the silence, "can I ask you something?" She looked up from her drawing, her big eyes meeting his. "Your last name is Parker, right? Do you know where your mom's family might be? Grandparents? Aunts or uncles?" Lily frowned, thinking hard. Mom didn't talk about them much, she said finally. She said they didn't want us. Jonathan's throat tightened. Did she ever say their names? Lily paused, her expression pensive. She said her dad's name was John or Jonathan, she said, her voice faltering as she glanced at him. But she didn't talk about him. Jonathan froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The room seemed to tilt slightly as her words sank in. He stared at Lily, his mind racing. Could it be? No, it was impossible. Yet, the pieces of the puzzle were starting to fit together in a way he couldn't ignore. Trying to keep his voice steady, he asked, "What was your mom's name?" "Margaret," Lily replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Margaret Parker. Jonathan's breath caught. He hadn't heard that name in years, not since his daughter had walked out of his life. He leaned back in his chair, his mind reeling. Was it really possible? Could this little girl sitting in front of him be his granddaughter? Lily watched him carefully, her small face filled with uncertainty. "Did I say something wrong?" she asked, her voice trembling. "No," Jonathan said quickly, forcing a smile. "You didn't say anything wrong at all." But his mind was already racing, a storm of emotions threatening to overwhelm him. If Lily truly was his granddaughter, then everything in his world was about to change. Jonathan couldn't sleep that night. The revelation gnawed at him, the pieces of the puzzle rearranging themselves in his mind, forming a picture he wasn't sure he was ready to see. He sat in his study, the soft crackle of the fire the only sound in the room. His hands trembled slightly as he held an old photo album in his lap. He hadn't opened it in years, not since the family had splintered. Now, it felt like a lifeline. Turning the pages slowly, he paused at a picture of Margaret as a child. She was 7 or 8, close to Lily's age, with the same wide eyes and the same soft curls framing her face. The resemblance was uncanny, and it sent a shiver down his spine. He ran a finger over the photograph, memories flooding back. He could almost hear her laughter, see her running through the yard with her brothers, her voice calling out, "Daddy, look at me." But that was a lifetime ago. The little girl in the photograph had grown into a woman who had disappeared from his life, taking her love, her trust, and her presence with her. He had tried to justify it back then, telling himself that Margaret had been influenced by her mother, that the estrangement wasn't his fault. But deep down, he knew better. He had failed her, just as he had failed all his children. Now, here was this little girl, this Lily, carrying not only Margaret's name but also her spirit. And if she was Margaret's daughter, that meant Margaret was out there somewhere. Or at least, she had been. The thought filled him with equal parts hope and dread. Where was Margaret now? And why was Lily alone? The next morning, Jonathan made a decision. He would find out the truth, no matter how painful it might be. But first, he needed to tread carefully with Lily. If he pushed too hard, he risked scaring her, and he couldn't bear the thought of losing her too. Over breakfast, he watched her as she buttered a piece of toast, her small hands moving with quiet focus. "Lily," he said gently, breaking the silence, "I was thinking we could go for a drive today. Maybe look around for some clues about where your mom might be." Lily looked up at him, her expression uncertain. "Do you think we'll find her?" Jonathan hesitated, then nodded. "I hope so, sweetheart. But even if we don't, we'll figure something out together. I promise." She gave him a small, hesitant smile, and something in Jonathan's chest ached. He wanted to protect her, to shield her from the pain of the world. But he also knew he couldn't make promises he wasn't sure he could keep. Still, the flicker of trust in her eyes was enough to propel him forward. They started in the neighborhood where he had found her, visiting shelters and community centers, asking if anyone recognized Lily or knew her mother. Most people shook their heads sympathetically, offering kind words but little help. Lily stayed close to Jonathan, clutching her bear tightly as she watched the world around her with wary eyes. At one shelter, an older woman with a kind smile studied Lily for a long moment before nodding slowly. "I think I've seen her before," she said. "Her mom used to bring her here sometimes, looking for help. Margaret, right?" Jonathan's heart leapt. "Yes, that's her name. Do you know where she might be now?" The woman frowned, her expression turning somber. "I haven't seen Margaret in a while. She seemed to be struggling the last time she was here." I think she mentioned staying in a motel on the edge of town, but that was months ago. Jonathan felt a wave of mixed relief and fear. It was a lead, but the uncertainty of Margaret's situation gnawed at him. Thanking the woman, he guided Lily back to the car, his mind racing. He didn't want to alarm her, but the thought of Margaret being out there, possibly in trouble, filled him with urgency. As they drove toward the area the woman had mentioned, Lily broke the silence. "Did you know my mom?" she asked, her voice quiet but curious. Jonathan gripped the steering wheel tightly, choosing his words carefully. "I think I might have," he said. "A long time ago." Lily studied him, her small face serious. "Why didn't you see her anymore?" The question hit him harder than he expected. He glanced at her briefly before returning his gaze to the road. "Sometimes," he said slowly, "grown-ups make mistakes. Big mistakes. And when they do, it can hurt the people they care about. I think I made one of those mistakes with your mom." Lily didn't reply immediately, but her expression softened slightly. "She said my grandpa didn't love her," she said quietly. Jonathan's throat tightened. "She was wrong about that," he said firmly. "I've always loved her. I just didn't show it the way I should have." They drove in silence for a while after that, the weight of the conversation lingering in the air. When they finally reached the rundown motel the woman had mentioned, Jonathan's heart sank. The building was shabby, with peeling paint and a flickering neon sign. He approached the front desk, hoping against hope for good news. The clerk, a disinterested young man, barely glanced up from his phone. "Yeah, I remember her," he said when Jonathan showed him a photo of Margaret from the shelter. "She stayed here for a bit, but she hasn't been back in weeks. Left in a hurry, I think." "Did she say where she was going?" Jonathan asked, his voice tense. The clerk shrugged. "Not that I remember." "Sorry." Jonathan returned to the car feeling defeated. He sat behind the wheel for a long moment, staring out at the gray sky. Lily looked up at him, her expression hopeful despite everything. "Do you think we'll find her?" she asked again. Jonathan reached over and gently took her hand. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I promise I'll keep trying." As they drove back home, Jonathan's mind churned with questions and doubts, but one thing was clear. He wasn't giving up. For the first time in years, he had something worth fighting for, and he wasn't about to let it slip away. Jonathan spent the next few days consumed by his search. The realization that Lily was likely his granddaughter filled him with an urgency he hadn't felt in years. He scoured every possible lead, retracing Margaret's last known movements, visiting shelters, and speaking to anyone who might have crossed her path. Despite his best efforts, each trail seemed to grow colder, leaving him both frustrated and more determined. At home, Lily had begun to settle into a routine, though the uncertainty of her situation weighed on both of them. She spent most of her time drawing or sitting by the fire with her bear. Every so often, Jonathan would catch her staring out the window, her face clouded with worry. He tried his best to keep her spirits up, telling her stories about Christmases long ago when his children were young, hoping to spark a sense of warmth and normalcy. To his relief, she began to smile more often, though the shadows in her eyes remained. One evening, as they sat together after dinner, Lily looked up from her sketchpad and asked, "Do you think my mom's okay?" Jonathan set down his coffee cup, his heart heavy. He wanted to reassure her, to promise her that everything would be fine, but the truth was, he didn't know. "I hope so," he said gently, "but no matter what happens, we're going to figure this out together. You're not alone anymore, Lily." Her small smile in response broke his heart. He could see how much she wanted to believe him, how much she needed to feel safe. It was a look he remembered all too well. Margaret had worn that same expression when she was a little girl, seeking comfort from a world that often felt too big and unpredictable. The following morning, Jonathan received an unexpected call from one of the shelters he'd visited earlier in the week. A staff member mentioned that a woman matching Margaret's description had been spotted a few nights ago at a local soup kitchen. She hadn't stayed long, but she'd mentioned looking for work before leaving abruptly. The news reignited Jonathan's determination. He immediately bundled Lily into the car, explaining that they were following another lead. The drive to the soup kitchen was quiet, the tension in the air palpable. Jonathan could feel Lily's gaze on him, her small hands clutching her bear tightly. When they arrived, The bustling kitchen was filled with the clatter of dishes and the murmur of conversations. Jonathan approached a volunteer and showed them the photograph of Margaret that he carried everywhere now. The woman studied it for a moment before nodding. "Yeah, I remember her," she said. "She came by a few days ago. Looked tired, like she'd been through a lot. She didn't stay long, though. Seemed like she was in a hurry." Jonathan's chest tightened. "Did she say where she was going?" The volunteer shook her head. "Not really, but she asked about day labor jobs in the area. Might be worth checking around some of the spots where people pick up work." Thanking the woman, Jonathan led Lily back to the car. His mind raced as he considered their next move. If Margaret was looking for work, it meant she was still trying to make things better for herself and Lily. But it also meant she was likely still in a precarious situation, vulnerable and alone. They spent the rest of the day visiting the places the volunteer had mentioned: construction sites, warehouses, and even a few factories. But each inquiry ended in disappointment. By late afternoon, Jonathan felt the weight of exhaustion pressing down on him. He glanced at Lily, who was sitting quietly in the back seat, her bear on her lap. She looked so small, so patient despite everything. "I think we've done enough for today," he said, his voice heavy. "Let's head home." The drive back was quiet, the fading sunlight casting long shadows across the snowy landscape. Jonathan's thoughts were a storm of worry and regret. He couldn't shake the image of Margaret, tired and struggling, and the realization that he had played a part in her hardships. If only he had been there for her. If only he had fought harder to stay connected after the divorce. When they arrived home, the house felt colder than usual, the cheer of the Christmas tree unable to lift Jonathan's spirits. He prepared a simple dinner for Lily, though he barely touched his own plate. She seemed to sense his mood and ate quietly, offering no complaints. After dinner, Lily surprised him by crawling onto the couch beside him, her bear tucked under one arm. She looked up at him, her wide eyes filled with a mixture of innocence and understanding. "You don't have to be sad," she said softly. "My mom always said things get better if you don't give up." Jonathan felt his throat tighten. He reached out and gently pulled her into a hug, her small frame fitting perfectly against his chest. "You're a very smart girl, Lily," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And I promise I'm not going to give up. Not on your mom. Not on you." That night, as Lily slept upstairs, Jonathan sat by the fire once more, the photo album open on his lap. He traced the edges of Margaret's childhood photos, his heart aching with a mixture of longing and determination. He knew he had to find her, not just for Lily's sake, but for his own. He couldn't change the past, but maybe, just maybe, he could mend the present. In the days that followed, Jonathan reached out to old contacts, people he hadn't spoken to in years. One of them, an old friend who worked in real estate, mentioned hearing about a woman who had recently been evicted from a rundown apartment complex on the other side of town. She had been asking about temporary housing options and had left in a hurry when she couldn't pay her overdue rent. Jonathan's heart sank at the thought of Margaret being in such dire straits, but the lead gave him hope. He promised himself that he would find her, no matter how long it took. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of purpose, a chance to make things right. As he tucked Lily into bed that night, she looked up at him with sleepy eyes and whispered, "Do you think we'll find her soon?" Jonathan smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I do, Lily. And when we do, everything's going to be okay." Jonathan's car rolled slowly down the icy street, the wipers scraping against the windshield as snow began to fall again. The lead about the eviction had brought him to another shabby part of town, a stark contrast to the world he had once built his fortune in. The buildings here were run down, with peeling paint and boarded-up windows, and the streets were quiet except for the occasional bark of a dog or the crunch of snow underfoot. Jonathan glanced at Lily in the passenger seat. She clutched her bear tightly, her eyes scanning the unfamiliar surroundings. He parked the car in front of an old apartment complex that leaned precariously against its neighbors. The landlord, a gruff man with a cigarette dangling from his lips, had agreed to meet him outside. As Jonathan approached, the man squinted at him suspiciously. "You the one asking about the woman?" the landlord said, his voice rough from years of smoking. "What's it to you?" Jonathan straightened, keeping his tone calm but firm. I'm trying to find her. She's family. The landlord raised an eyebrow, then shrugged. She left a couple weeks back. Couldn't pay the rent. Last I heard, she was staying at some motel off Route 9. But good luck finding her. She's been moving around a lot. Jonathan nodded, slipping the man a few bills for the information. He turned back to the car, his thoughts racing. Another motel. Another fleeting chance. But at least it was something. A direction, a thread to pull. The drive to the motel was silent, the tension in the car palpable. Lily stared out the window, her face unreadable. Jonathan wanted to reassure her, but he wasn't sure how. What could he say when the answers they were searching for seemed to slip further away at every turn? When they finally arrived, the motel looked even worse than the last one. Its faded sign flickered weakly, and the parking lot was half empty, with a few battered cars parked haphazardly. Jonathan's chest tightened as he stepped out into the cold, his breath visible in the icy air. Inside the cramped lobby, he approached the desk clerk, a bored-looking young woman scrolling through her phone. He pulled out the same photo of Margaret he had shown to so many others. "I'm looking for this woman," he said, his voice steady despite the anxiety coiling in his chest. "She might have stayed here recently." The clerk glanced at the photo, then frowned. "Yeah, I think I remember her," she said slowly. "She had a little girl with her, but they didn't stay long. Checked out about a week ago." Jonathan's heart sank. Another dead end. Did she say where she was going? The clerk shook her head. She didn't talk much, just paid in cash and left. "Sorry." Jonathan thanked her and turned to leave, his shoulders slumping. As he stepped back into the cold, he felt the weight of defeat pressing down on him. How much longer could he keep this up? How many more leads would slip through his fingers? Back in the car, Lily's small voice broke the silence. "We didn't find her, did we?" Jonathan shook his head, gripping the steering wheel tightly. "Not this time," he admitted. "But we're getting closer. I can feel it." Lily didn't say anything, but the disappointment in her eyes was clear. Jonathan's chest ached as he started the car, the engine rumbling softly. He had promised her they would find Margaret, but every failed attempt chipped away at his confidence. As they drove back toward the city, Jonathan couldn't stop thinking about Margaret. Where was she? Was she safe? He replayed their last conversation in his mind. All those years ago, when she had stormed out of his house, her voice shaking with anger and hurt. He had let her go, convinced at the time that it was what she wanted. But now, as he pieced together the fragments of her life, he realized just how wrong he had been. Back at the mansion, Lily went straight to the couch, curling up with her bear while Jonathan prepared dinner. He moved through the motions mechanically, his mind elsewhere. When he finally brought the plates to the table, he noticed Lily was unusually quiet, her eyes fixed on the Christmas tree. "What's on your mind, Lily?" he asked gently, sitting down across from her. She hesitated, then looked up at him. "What if we never find her?" she whispered. Jonathan's throat tightened. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "We will," he said firmly. "It might take time, but we'll find her. I promise." "But what if she doesn't want to come back?" Lily's voice trembled, and Jonathan saw the fear in her eyes, the same fear he had been battling in his own heart. He reached across the table and took her hand. "If there's one thing I know about your mom, it's that she loves you," he said. "No matter what's happened, no matter how hard things have been, she would never stop loving you. And I won't stop trying to bring her back." Lily nodded slowly, though her expression remained uncertain. Jonathan could see how much she was struggling, how the weight of her young life had already shaped her in ways no child should endure. It broke his heart, but it also strengthened his resolve. That night, after Lily had fallen asleep, Jonathan sat by the fire, staring at the flames. He thought about the man he used to be, the ambitious businessman who had put his work above everything else, who had let his pride and stubbornness drive a wedge between himself and the people he loved. He thought about the father he should have been, the moments he had missed, the words he had left unsaid. And he thought about Margaret, out there somewhere, trying to survive. He knew he couldn't undo the past, but he could fight for the future. He could fight for Lily, for Margaret, for the family he had lost and might still have a chance to rebuild. As the fire crackled softly, Jonathan made a silent vow. He would not stop until he found his daughter. No matter how long it took, no matter how many doors he had to knock on, he would bring her home. The morning air was crisp, the kind that stung Jonathan's lungs as he stepped out onto the front porch to collect the paper. Snow had fallen overnight, blanketing the mansion's expansive yard in a glistening white sheet. Normally, he would have paused to admire the stillness, but today his mind was elsewhere, consumed with the search for Margaret. As he unfolded the paper, he glanced through the headlines absent-mindedly until a small notice in the local section caught his attention. It was a story about a charity event taking place at a downtown church that evening, a free Christmas dinner for the homeless and those in need. The mention of free meals and community support struck a chord. If Margaret had been struggling to make ends meet, she might have sought out events like this one. It was a long shot, but Jonathan had learned not to dismiss even the smallest possibilities. When Lily came downstairs, still sleepy-eyed, but with her bear tucked under her arm, Jonathan told her about the dinner. "I thought we could go tonight," he said, keeping his tone light. "It might be a good chance to meet people and ask if anyone's seen your mom." Lily's eyes brightened slightly, a flicker of hope sparking through the cloud of uncertainty. "Do you think she might be there?" she asked. "I think it's worth a try," Jonathan said, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "And if not, we'll keep looking." The hours leading up to the dinner passed slowly. Jonathan tried to keep Lily occupied, helping her decorate cookies in the kitchen and reading aloud from an old book of Christmas stories. But even as they laughed and talked, he could see the tension in her small shoulders, the way her eyes darted toward the clock as if willing time to move faster. When evening finally arrived, they bundled up and drove into the city. The church was a modest building nestled between larger, more modern structures, its stained glass windows glowing warmly in the twilight. The parking lot was already filling up, and volunteers bustled about, carrying trays of food and setting up tables. Inside, the atmosphere was lively and welcoming. Families, individuals, and volunteers mingled, the scent of roasted turkey and fresh-baked bread wafting through the air. Jonathan held Lily's hand tightly as they made their way through the crowd, his eyes scanning every face, his heart pounding with a mixture of hope and dread. As they waited in line for food, Jonathan began striking up conversations with those around him, showing Margaret's photo and asking if anyone had seen her. Most people shook their heads apologetically, offering kind words but no answers. Lily stayed close to his side, her bear clutched tightly as she listened intently to each exchange. They had nearly reached the end of the line when an older woman, bundled in a thick coat and scarf, paused as Jonathan showed her the photo. Her brow furrowed in recognition. "I've seen her," the woman said slowly. "She came through here a couple of weeks ago. Looked real tired, poor thing. Said she was trying to get to a shelter on the other side of town." Jonathan's heart leapt. "Do you know which shelter?" The woman nodded. "The one on Maple Street. It's not too far from here." Jonathan thanked her profusely, his chest tightening with a mixture of relief and anticipation. He glanced down at Lily, who was looking up at him with wide eyes. "Did you hear that?" he said softly. "We have another place to look." Lily smiled faintly, and for the first time in days, Jonathan felt a flicker of real hope. After finishing their meal, they left the church and headed toward the shelter, the night growing colder as snow began to fall again. The city streets were quiet, the only sounds the hum of the car engine and the occasional crunch of tires on the snow-covered roads. When they arrived, the shelter was bustling with activity. Volunteers were handing out blankets and hot drinks, while residents gathered in small groups, talking and laughing softly. Jonathan approached the front desk, where a middle-aged woman was checking in new arrivals. He pulled out Margaret's photo once more, his voice steady despite the anxiety bubbling beneath the surface. "I'm looking for this woman," he said. "She might have stayed here recently." The woman studied the photo, her expression thoughtful. "I remember her," she said finally. "She came by a little over a week ago with her daughter. She seemed really worn out, said she was trying to find work. She left after a couple of nights, though." Jonathan's stomach sank. Did she say where she was going? The woman hesitated. She mentioned something about trying to get back to her old neighborhood. Said she had a friend there who might be able to help. Jonathan nodded, his mind racing. "Do you have any idea which neighborhood she meant?" The woman shook her head. I'm sorry, that's all I know. But if she comes back, I can let her know you're looking for her. Jonathan thanked her, his chest tightening as he turned back to Lily. She was sitting on a nearby bench, her bear in her lap, her eyes filled with quiet anticipation. When he approached, she looked up at him, her expression searching. They remember her, he said softly. She was here, but she's moved on. We're getting closer, Lily. I can feel it. Lily nodded, her small face serious. She's trying to find us too, she said firmly. I know she is. Jonathan felt a lump rise in his throat. He knelt in front of her, taking her small hands in his. Then we'll keep looking, he said, until we find her. As they drove back home through the softly falling snow, Jonathan couldn't help but feel a sense of renewed determination. Each step brought them closer, each encounter another piece of the puzzle. He didn't know how long the journey would take, but he knew one thing for certain. He wouldn't stop until his family was whole again. The morning after their visit to the shelter, Jonathan awoke with a sense of purpose. The lead about Margaret's attempt to return to her old neighborhood felt like the most promising clue they'd had in days. He stood by the window, looking out over the snow-covered grounds, his mind racing. The idea that Margaret was trying to reconnect with something familiar made sense. She had always been sentimental, clinging to memories of better times. It was a trait she had inherited from her mother, though Jonathan had only realized it too late. Downstairs, Lily was already awake, sitting by the fire with her bear. She looked up as Jonathan entered the room, her eyes filled with the quiet determination that seemed to mirror his own. Are we going to look for her again today? She asked. Jonathan nodded. Yes, we are. I think I know where to start. He explained his plan to Lily over breakfast. Margaret had grown up in a modest neighborhood on the other side of the city, in a small house that Jonathan had bought when his business was just beginning to take off. Though they had moved away when the children were teenagers, Margaret had always spoken fondly of the house and the memories it held. Jonathan's gut told him that if she was searching for a place to feel safe, she might have gone back there. The drive to the old neighborhood was long, the streets becoming narrower and more worn as they moved away from the polished center of the city. The houses here were small and tightly packed, their paint peeling and their yards overgrown. Jonathan's memories of the place were hazy, colored by the stress and ambition of those early years when his focus had been on building his career. He had been present in body but not in spirit, and the house had always been more of a stopping point than a home for him. As they pulled up in front of the house, Jonathan was struck by how much it had changed. The once pristine white paint was now faded and chipped, and the garden Margaret's mother had tended so lovingly was little more than a patch of weeds. The sight filled him with a pang of regret. He had let so much slip through his fingers over the years, so much he hadn't appreciated until it was gone. Lily climbed out of the car, clutching her bear as she looked around with wide eyes. "This is where my mom lived?" she asked. "For a while," Jonathan said, his voice soft. "A long time ago." They walked up to the front door and knocked, the sound echoing in the quiet street. After a moment, the door creaked open, and an older man with a weary expression stepped out onto the porch. He eyed them cautiously. "Can I help you?" Jonathan pulled out the now familiar photo of Margaret. "I'm looking for my daughter," he said. "She used to live here. I thought she might have come back." The man studied the photo, his brow furrowing. "I don't recognize her," he said slowly, "but I've only been here a few years. Maybe some of the neighbors would know." Jonathan thanked him, his hope dimming slightly as they returned to the street. He and Lily spent the next few hours knocking on doors, speaking to anyone who would listen. Most of the neighbors were kind but unhelpful, offering only vague memories or blank stares. By the time they reached the end of the block, Jonathan felt the familiar weight of defeat settling over him. But as they approached the final house, a small voice called out from behind them. "Excuse me." Jonathan turned to see a woman in her 60s standing on the sidewalk. She had a scarf wrapped tightly around her neck and a grocery bag in her hand. "I overheard you asking about someone," she said. "Are you looking for Margaret Calloway?" Jonathan's heart leapt. "Yes. You know her?" The woman nodded slowly. "I used to babysit her and her brothers when they were kids. I thought I saw her a few days ago, over by the park down the street. She looked tired." but I'm almost certain it was her. Jonathan's pulse quickened. Thank you, he said, his voice filled with gratitude. We'll check the park right away. The park was small and tucked away behind a row of houses, its snow-covered benches and empty swings giving it a forlorn appearance. Jonathan parked the car at the edge of the lot, his eyes scanning the area. It was quiet, the only sound the crunch of their footsteps in the snow. Lily tugged at his hand, her voice trembling with excitement. Do you think she's here? Jonathan squeezed her hand gently. Let's find out. They walked slowly through the park, their breath visible in the frigid air. Jonathan's eyes darted from one shadow to the next, his heart pounding with a mix of hope and fear. Then, near the far edge of the park, he saw her. Margaret was sitting on a bench, her shoulders hunched against the cold, a worn coat wrapped tightly around her. Her hair was shorter than he remembered, streaked with gray, and her face was thinner, etched with lines that spoke of hardship. But it was her. There was no doubt in his mind. Margaret, he said, his voice breaking. She looked up sharply, her eyes widening as she recognized him. For a moment, she seemed frozen, her expression a mixture of shock and disbelief. Then her gaze shifted to Lily, who was standing beside him, clutching her bear tightly. Mom? Lily whispered, her voice trembling. Margaret's face crumpled as tears spilled down her cheeks. Lily, she choked out, rising to her feet. Oh, my baby. Lily ran to her, throwing her arms around her mother's waist as Margaret sank to her knees in the snow, holding her tightly. Jonathan stood back, his own eyes brimming with tears as he watched the reunion unfold. It was a moment he had dreamed of, but hadn't dared to believe would come. Margaret looked up at him, her voice shaking. How did you? Why are you here? Jonathan stepped closer, his voice soft but steady. I came to find you. I should have done it years ago, Margaret, but I'm here now. And I'm not leaving. Margaret's tears flowed freely as she nodded, her arms still wrapped around Lily. For the first time in years, Jonathan felt a flicker of something he hadn't known he was missing: hope. The small park seemed to hold its breath as the reunion unfolded. Jonathan stood still, his boots rooted in the snow, watching Margaret cling to Lily as if letting go might make her vanish. Lily sobbed quietly against her mother's shoulder, her small frame trembling with emotion. The sight tugged at Jonathan's heart, a mix of relief, guilt, and hope washing over him all at once. After what felt like an eternity, Margaret pulled back slightly, cupping Lily's face in her hands and brushing away her tears. My sweet girl, she whispered. I've missed you so much. I missed you too, Mom, Lily replied, her voice barely audible. She hugged her mother again, tighter this time, as if trying to make up for all the lost time. Margaret's gaze shifted to Jonathan, her expression guarded but filled with questions. She rose slowly to her feet, keeping one hand on Lily's shoulder as though needing the anchor. What are you doing here? She asked, her voice thick with emotion. Jonathan took a deep breath, his words measured. I've been looking for you, Margaret. For days now. I found Lily, and when I realized who she was, I had to find you too. Margaret's brow furrowed as she glanced down at Lily, then back at Jonathan. You've been with her? All this time? Jonathan nodded. I found her on Christmas Eve alone, out in the cold. She didn't have anywhere to go. I couldn't just leave her. He paused, his voice softening. She told me about you, about what's happened, and I knew I couldn't stay away any longer. Margaret's shoulders sagged, the weight of his words and the events of the past few weeks clearly pressing on her. She looked away, her gaze settling on a patch of snow-covered ground. I didn't think anyone was looking for me, she said quietly. I thought everyone had forgotten. Jonathan's throat tightened. I never forgot, Margaret. Not for a single day. I've made mistakes, more than I can count, but not a day has gone by that I didn't think about you and wish I had done things differently. Margaret's eyes met his, glistening with unshed tears. You didn't try, she said, her voice trembling. When Mom left, when everything fell apart, you didn't fight for us. You let us go. Jonathan felt the weight of her accusation like a blow, but he didn't look away. He had carried the guilt for years, and now, faced with the truth, he knew he couldn't hide from it. You're right, he admitted, his voice steady despite the lump in his throat. I didn't fight the way I should have. I let my pride and my work take over, and I pushed you all away. I can't change that, Margaret, but I want to make it right now. I want to be here for you and Lily. If you'll let me. Margaret looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she turned her attention back to Lily, smoothing her hair gently. Are you okay, baby? She asked, her voice softening. Lily nodded, leaning into her mother's side. I'm okay now, she said. Grandpa's been taking care of me. He told me we'd find you. Margaret's gaze softened as she looked at Jonathan again, though the wariness in her eyes hadn't completely faded. Why now? She asked. After all these years, why did you come looking for me? Jonathan hesitated, searching for the right words. Because I realized I couldn't keep running from the past, he said finally. Finding Lily reminded me of what I've lost, what I've been missing, and I don't want to miss any more. I want to be there for you, for both of you. Margaret's lips parted as if to respond, but no words came. Instead, she looked down at Lily, her fingers trembling slightly as she brushed a strand of hair from her daughter's face. The silence between them stretched, heavy with unspoken emotions. Finally, Margaret spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I've been so scared, she admitted. Scared of failing her, of not being enough. I tried to keep going, to make things work, but it's been so hard. You don't have to do it alone anymore, Jonathan said, stepping closer. Let me help you, please. Margaret's breath hitched, and for a moment, Jonathan thought she might refuse. But then she nodded, a single tear slipping down her cheek. I don't know how to trust this, she said, her voice trembling. But I can't do this by myself anymore. Lily deserves better. Jonathan felt a wave of relief, so profound it left him unsteady. Thank you, he said softly. Thank you for letting me try. They stood there for a while, the three of them, the snow falling gently around them as if the world itself was holding its breath. Lily clung to her mother's hand, her other hand still holding her bear, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Jonathan felt a glimmer of hope. Eventually, Margaret broke the silence. Where do we go from here? She asked, her voice uncertain. Home, Jonathan said simply. My home, if you'll come with me. It's big enough for all of us, and it's warm. You can take all the time you need to figure things out. Margaret hesitated, but then she nodded. Okay, she said quietly. Let's go. As they walked back to the car, Jonathan placed a hand gently on Margaret's shoulder, his heart swelling with a mixture of gratitude and determination. This was only the beginning, he knew. There were wounds to heal, trust to rebuild, and a future to create. But for the first time in years, he felt like he wasn't facing it alone. When they reached the car, Lily climbed into the back seat, and Margaret hesitated before settling into the passenger seat. As Jonathan started the engine and the car began to glide down the snowy street, he glanced at them both, his family, and felt a spark of something he hadn't dared to hope for, the chance to start again. The drive back to Jonathan's mansion was quiet, the kind of silence that hummed with unspoken thoughts and emotions too raw to articulate. Lily had fallen asleep in the back seat, her bear tucked securely under her arm, while Margaret stared out the passenger window, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Jonathan stole glances at her, wondering what she was thinking, how she was feeling. The lines etched into her face told him enough. She had been through more than he could imagine, and the weight of it all still clung to her. When they pulled into the long driveway, the house loomed before them, its lights glowing warmly against the snowy backdrop. Margaret shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her gaze flickering to Jonathan. This is where you live? She asked, her tone unreadable. Yes, Jonathan said quietly. It's home, though it hasn't felt much like one for a long time. Margaret nodded but said nothing. As Jonathan parked the car and stepped out, he moved to the back seat to lift Lily, who stirred slightly but didn't wake. Margaret followed, hesitating on the front steps as Jonathan unlocked the door and pushed it open. Come inside, he said gently, nodding toward the warmth spilling out into the cold night. You don't have to decide anything now. Just come in. Margaret took a deep breath and stepped over the threshold. The house seemed to envelop her immediately, the crackling fireplace in the living room casting a soft, golden light across the space. Jonathan carried Lily upstairs to the room she had been using, carefully tucking her into bed before returning to find Margaret standing in the middle of the living room, her arms crossed protectively. "This place is huge," she said, her voice tinged with something between awe and discomfort. "It doesn't feel like you." Jonathan smiled faintly. "It never really did. I built it when I thought I needed to prove something, to myself, to the world. But it's just a house. It's empty without people." Margaret glanced at him, her expression softening slightly. "It's beautiful, though. Lily must have loved it. She's brought it to life," Jonathan admitted. "Before her, it was just walls and rooms. She's given it meaning." Margaret looked down at her hands, her fingers twisting together nervously. "She deserves so much more than I've been able to give her. She deserves a mother who loves her," Jonathan said firmly. "And she has that. She always has." Margaret's eyes glistened as she looked up at him. "I've tried so hard, Dad, to make it work, to keep her safe. But every time I thought we were getting ahead, something would happen to knock us back down. I didn't want her to see me fail." "You didn't fail," Jonathan said, stepping closer. "You did what you could with what you had, and that's more than most people would have managed. But you don't have to do it alone anymore." Margaret exhaled shakily, her walls beginning to crack. "I don't know how to trust that," she admitted. "It's been so long since I've let anyone in." "Start small," Jonathan said. "Stay here for now. Let me help you. Help Lily. That's all I ask. The rest, we'll figure it out." Margaret nodded slowly, her shoulders relaxing just a fraction. "Okay," she said softly. "For now." Jonathan offered her a small smile. "That's all I need." Over the next few days, Margaret began to settle in, though cautiously, as if waiting for something to go wrong. She was quiet, spending most of her time in the guest room or with Lily, who seemed to blossom in her mother's presence. Jonathan gave them space, but he found small ways to show he was there. Leaving extra blankets outside their door, making sure Margaret had tea in the mornings, setting out fresh towels in the bathroom. One evening, as they sat around the dinner table, Jonathan decided to broach a subject that had been weighing on his mind. "Margaret," he said, his tone careful, "I know things are still uncertain, but have you thought about what you'd like to do next? Whether it's finding work or—" "I don't know yet," she interrupted, her voice tense. I need time to figure things out." "Of course," Jonathan said quickly. "Take all the time you need. I just want you to know that whatever you decide, I'll support you." Margaret glanced at him, her expression softening. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For everything." Jonathan nodded, but he could feel the undercurrent of unease in her voice. She was still guarded, still carrying the weight of her struggles, and he knew it would take time for her to feel secure. He was prepared to wait, to earn her trust day by day. That night, as he sat by the fire with a book, Margaret came into the living room, surprising him. She stood by the mantel, her fingers brushing against an old photograph of the family from years ago. "You kept this?" she asked, holding it up. Jonathan set down his book. "I've kept all of them," he said. "Even when things fell apart, I couldn't let go of the memories." Margaret studied the photo, her expression distant. "We used to be happy," she said softly. "Didn't we?" "We did," Jonathan said. "And we can be again." Margaret looked at him, her eyes searching his face. "Do you really believe that?" "I do," Jonathan said firmly. "It won't be easy, but we've been given a second chance, and I'm not going to waste it." Margaret nodded slowly, a faint glimmer of hope in her eyes. "Neither will I," she said. As she returned the photo to the mantel and sat down in the chair across from him, Jonathan felt a sense of quiet progress. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in years, it felt like they were moving toward something. Something whole, something real. And for now, that was enough. The snow fell softly outside the mansion as Christmas morning dawned. The air inside was warm, filled with the faint aroma of cinnamon from the rolls Jonathan had baked earlier that morning. A recipe he hadn't touched in years, but remembered for this special day. The tree in the living room sparkled with lights and ornaments, a few new ones added by Lily during their time together. For the first time in a long while, The house felt alive. Jonathan stood in the kitchen, arranging mugs of hot cocoa on a tray. He'd woken up early, wanting to create something meaningful, even simple, to mark the day. As he carried the tray to the living room, he paused in the doorway. Margaret and Lily were seated together on the floor near the tree, Lily's laughter ringing out as she excitedly tore into a small gift Jonathan had wrapped for her, a new set of art supplies. Margaret's smile was soft but genuine as she watched her daughter's joy. Jonathan stepped in quietly, setting the tray on the coffee table. "Merry Christmas," he said, his voice warm. Lily beamed up at him, clutching a handful of colored pencils. "Grandpa, look what I got." "Thank you." Jonathan chuckled, his chest tightening at the sound of her happiness. "I'm glad you like it, sweetheart." Margaret's gaze met his, a mixture of gratitude and something deeper, an unspoken understanding that lingered between them. "Merry Christmas, Dad," she said softly. Jonathan smiled, his heart swelling. It had been years since he'd heard her call him that. "Merry Christmas, Margaret." They spent the morning unwrapping the rest of the modest pile of gifts beneath the tree. Jonathan had picked out a soft sweater for Margaret, which she accepted with a quiet thank you and a faint blush, and he watched as Lily excitedly handed her mother a drawing she had made, a portrait of the three of them standing together under a shining sun. Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she held it, tears welling in her eyes. "It's beautiful, Lily," she said, pulling her daughter into a hug. "I'll treasure it forever." As the morning unfolded, the easy warmth between them grew, filling the spaces where pain and distance had once lingered. Jonathan found himself marveling at the small, tender moments, Lily's giggles as she showed off her drawing skills, Margaret's soft laugh when she found Jonathan's old attempts at wrapping gifts clumsy but endearing. It was as though the house had been waiting for this day, for this reunion, to finally come alive again. Later, as the sunlight began to fade and the snow continued to fall, Jonathan suggested they all sit down for dinner. The dining room, once a place of formality and distance, felt intimate and welcoming. Jonathan had prepared a simple but hearty meal, and as they ate, the conversation flowed naturally. Margaret began to open up about the challenges she had faced, the jobs she'd taken, and the moments when she had nearly lost hope. Jonathan listened intently, his heart aching with both sorrow and pride at her resilience. "I was so scared I'd never be enough for her," Margaret said, glancing at Lily, who was happily nibbling on a piece of pie. "But she kept me going. Every time I wanted to give up, I'd look at her and remember why I couldn't." "You've done more than enough," Jonathan said, his voice firm. "You've been strong for her in ways I can't imagine. But you don't have to do it alone anymore." Margaret nodded, her expression softening. "I'm starting to believe that," she said quietly. After dinner, they returned to the living room, where the fire crackled warmly. Jonathan sat back in his chair, watching as Margaret and Lily worked together on a puzzle Lily had found in one of the gift boxes. Their laughter filled the room, a sound so full of life and light that it almost brought Jonathan to tears. As the clock struck 8, Lily yawned, her head nodding sleepily as she leaned against her mother. Margaret gently lifted her, carrying her upstairs to bed. Jonathan watched them go, a deep sense of peace settling over him. When Margaret returned, she found Jonathan still sitting by the fire, staring into the flames. She hesitated for a moment, then took the seat across from him. The quiet between them was comfortable, a shared reflection of the day's events. "I don't know how to thank you," Margaret said finally, her voice low. "For everything. For finding us. For not giving up." Jonathan met her gaze, his expression earnest. "You don't need to thank me," he said. "You're my daughter, Margaret. I've made a lot of mistakes, but not a day has gone by that I haven't loved you. I just didn't know how to show it back then. I let my pride and my work take over, and I lost the most important things in my life." Margaret looked down, her hands fidgeting in her lap. "I wanted to hate you," she admitted. "For so long, I told myself I didn't need you. But deep down, I missed you. I just didn't know how to say it." Jonathan's voice softened. "I missed you too. Every day." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Margaret reached out, placing her hand over his. "Maybe we can start over," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "For Lily's sake. For all of us." Jonathan felt a lump rise in his throat as he nodded. "I'd like that," he said. "I'd like that very much." As the fire crackled softly between them, Jonathan felt something shift, a weight lifting, a crack mending. This was not the end of their story, but the beginning of a new chapter. There would be challenges ahead, wounds to heal, and trust to rebuild. But for the first time in years, he felt ready to face it all. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in a soft, quiet promise of renewal. Inside, the warmth of family, fragile but real, filled the house, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, love could find a way to light the path forward.